Tonight, we will journey through one of history's most transformative periods, when the scent of change mingled with the aroma of fresh bread in Parisian bakeries, and the sound of wooden clogs on cobblestones echoed through streets where revolution was quietly brewing. As darkness falls over the same ancient stones where history unfolded, we'll discover how a kingdom that had endured for centuries could dissolve into something entirely new in less than a decade. But this story begins not with the dramatic clash of steel or the thunder of crowds, but with something far more subtle: the gentle rustle of silk in palace corridors and the whispered conversations of those who sensed that their world was about to change forever. Picture France in the 1780s, a land where morning mist still clung to the same valleys that had witnessed the rise and fall of countless generations. The air itself seemed heavy with anticipation, though few could have imagined the magnitude of transformation that lay ahead. In the Grand Palace of Versailles, 25 kilometers from Paris, the daily rhythm of court life continued with its elaborate ceremonies and precise etiquette. The King's Day began at precisely 8:30 each morning, when the first valet de chambre would whisper the traditional words, "Sire, it's time to get up." What followed was a carefully choreographed dance of privilege and protocol, where approximately 100 male courtiers would witness the sovereign's morning ablutions, each knowing their exact place in this intricate social ballet. The palace corridors, with their gleaming parquet floors and ornate mirrors, reflected not just candlelight, but an entire social order that had remained fundamentally unchanged for centuries. Yet outside these gilded walls, France was a nation of contrasts that would soon prove impossible to sustain. The kingdom stretched across fertile plains where wheat swayed in summer breezes, through dense forests where peasants gathered wood for their humble hearths, and into bustling market squares where the price of bread determined whether families would feast or fast. The very foundations of this society rested upon an ancient system known as the Ancien Régime, a structure as rigid and intricate as the formal gardens that surrounded the palace, yet far more fragile than anyone dared imagine. In this world of the 1780s, French society was divided into 3 distinct estates, each as clearly defined as the separate sections of a formal garden. The first estate comprised the clergy, from humble parish priests who earned as little as 500 francs per year to wealthy bishops who lived in palaces rivaling those of nobles. These men of God, numbering around 130,000 souls, roughly 0.5% of France's population, wielded not only spiritual authority, but also controlled vast landed estates that had been accumulating for centuries. The morning prayers in village churches and the magnificent ceremonies in cathedral sanctuaries both resonated with the same power that exempted the entire First Estate from most taxes, a privilege that grew more controversial with each passing season. The Second Estate, the nobility, lived in a world of refined elegance, where the rustle of silk gowns and the click of jeweled heels on marble floors provided the soundtrack to their privileged existence. Comprising roughly 1.5% of the population, these men and women inhabited chateaux, where tapestries depicted their ancestors' glorious deeds, and where the morning air carried the sounds of hunting horns and the gentle whicker of thoroughbred horses. Their days unfolded in leisurely pursuits, perhaps a morning ride through estate grounds where tenant farmers bowed respectfully, an afternoon of cards in salons where conversation sparkled as brightly as the chandeliers above, or evening entertainments where musicians played compositions that would echo through history. Yet beneath this graceful surface lay growing anxiety, for many nobles sensed that their ancient privileges were increasingly viewed with resentment by those who labored to support such luxury. But it was the Third Estate that truly defined France, encompassing everyone who belonged to neither clergy nor nobility, a vast multitude representing over 98% of the kingdom's 28 million inhabitants. Here was the true heart of the nation, the merchants whose shops lined narrow streets filled with the mingled aromas of spices, leather, and fresh bread, the artisans whose skilled hands crafted everything from delicate porcelain to sturdy furniture, the lawyers and doctors who formed a growing educated class, and above all, the millions of peasants whose calloused hands worked the soil that fed the kingdom. These were the people who rose before dawn to tend their crops, who knew the weight of tax collectors' demands, and who felt most keenly the sting of inequality in a system that granted privileges based on birth rather than merit. The peasants of 18th century France lived lives governed by the ancient rhythms of season and soil, their days beginning with the first pale light of dawn and ending when darkness made further labor impossible. In villages scattered across the countryside, thatched roof cottages stood in clusters, their windows glowing with the warm light of oil lamps as families gathered around rough wooden tables for their simple meals. The average rural household consumed 2 4-pound loaves of bread daily, and with a skilled mason earning perhaps 50 sous per day, while bread cost 8 or 9 sous per loaf, the mathematics of survival left little room for comfort. During years when harvest failed or grain grew scarce, peasant families would resort to mixing bran with rather disgusting herbs, finding happiness in adding even a small portion of butter or cheese to their meager fare. The texture of peasant life was rough wool against skin, the smell of wood smoke and animals, the taste of brown bread and thin soup. Their homes, often shared with livestock during harsh winters, were filled with the sounds of spinning wheels, the gentle lowing of cattle, and the whispered prayers that began and ended each precarious day. When times grew desperate, and they often did, entire families would take to the roads as beggars, joining the streams of displaced people who wandered between villages seeking charity from neighbors who had little enough to spare. Sometimes, desperation drove them to more direct action, as when bands of women armed with pitchforks would stop merchants' carts and force them to sell bread at prices the hungry could afford. Yet even in the grandest palace in Europe, another kind of constraint shaped daily existence, though gilded and perfumed beyond recognition. At Versailles, Marie Antoinette's day began at 8 in the morning with a ceremony as elaborate as any religious ritual. The queen would emerge from sleep to find her wardrobe woman presenting a basket of offerings, chemises, handkerchiefs, and towels laid out with sacred precision. What followed was a ballet of etiquette so complex that nothing could be passed directly to the queen. Each item must travel through a hierarchy of hands, from the most humble servant up through ladies of increasing rank, until it finally reached the royal fingers. The very act of dressing required the choreographed participation of dozens of courtiers, each knowing exactly when to curtsy, when to speak, and when to maintain reverent silence. The contrast could not have been starker. While peasant women worked their hands raw in fields and kitchens, the Queen of France required assistance to don the most basic garments. While rural families cherished a handful of coins, the court at Versailles spent fortunes on entertainments that lasted a single evening. The morning chocolate served in delicate porcelain cups to Marie Antoinette cost more than many peasant families saw in a month. Yet such expenditures were considered so natural as to be invisible to those who enjoyed them. This gap between experiences, between the rough wooden spoon of the peasant's table and the silver implements of the royal breakfast, created a tension that would soon prove impossible to contain. Centuries earlier, this same tension had been building in different forms. As France's financial structure grew increasingly unstable beneath the weight of its own contradictions, the kingdom's debt had swollen like a river in spring flood, fed by costly wars that stretched across continents and decades. The 7 Years' War alone had cost 1.8 billion livres, while France's participation in the American War of Independence added another 1.3 billion livres to the crushing burden, more than double the crown's annual revenue for a single conflict. Each military adventure, each diplomatic triumph, each assertion of French power in the complex dance of European politics added another layer of debt that future generations would somehow need to repay. The peculiar architecture of French taxation made this burden even more difficult to bear. While the Third Estate, those least able to pay, shouldered the heaviest tax burden, the First and Second Estates enjoyed extensive exemptions that had accumulated over centuries like sediment in a riverbed. The nobility, who controlled much of France's wealth, paid the 20e tax of 5% on their incomes, but avoided many other levies entirely. Meanwhile, the clergy contributed virtually nothing to the royal treasury, despite controlling vast estates that could have sustained entire provinces. The result was a system where those with the greatest means bore the lightest burdens, while those with the least carried weights that grew heavier with each passing year. By the late 1780s, the very air of France seemed charged with possibility and danger, like the humid atmosphere before a thunderstorm. In coffee houses and salons, educated men and women gathered to discuss ideas that would have been unthinkable to previous generations. Concepts of natural rights, social contracts, and government by consent that drifted through conversations like incense through a cathedral. The writings of philosophers like Voltaire and Rousseau circulated in leather-bound volumes and cheaply printed pamphlets alike, their words igniting imaginations with visions of a world where merit might matter more than birth, where justice might be blind to privilege, and where the happiness of the many might outweigh the convenience of the few. From across the Atlantic, news arrived of another revolution where these very ideas had been put into practice. The American colonists' successful rebellion against British rule provided a tangible example that established power could be challenged and overthrown, that new forms of government could emerge from the ashes of the old. French officers who had served in that distant conflict returned home with stories of citizen soldiers and written constitutions, of leaders chosen by popular will rather than divine appointment. The very possibility that political change could be achieved, and achieved successfully, settled into French consciousness like seeds in fertile soil. Meanwhile, the royal government found itself caught in an impossible situation, requiring reforms that its own structure made nearly impossible to implement. King Louis XVI, well-meaning but indecisive, would announce plans for change only to retreat when faced with opposition from the very groups whose cooperation he most needed. The regional parliaments, those ancient judicial bodies, blocked financial reforms with the same determination they had shown for centuries in defending their traditional privileges. Every attempt to rationalize the tax system, to make the wealthy pay their fair share, or to streamline the bewildering complexity of French administration foundered on the rocks of entrenched interests and inherited rights. The crisis deepened when news spread of a royal banquet held at Versailles on October 1st, 1789, a seemingly innocent celebration that would prove to be the spark that ignited long, smoldering resentments. The officers of the Flanders Regiment had arrived to reinforce the royal bodyguard, and according to military custom, they were welcomed with a formal banquet. What might have remained a private affair became a symbol of everything wrong with the kingdom when newspapers reported the event as a gluttonous orgy, where officers allegedly trampled the tricolor cockade, the symbol of the emerging nation, underfoot while proclaiming loyalty only to the white cockade of the House of Bourbon. Whether these reports were accurate mattered less than the fact that they confirmed what many already believed, that the privileged classes held the common people in contempt. Yet the true foundations of revolution had been laid months earlier in a tennis court at Versailles, where the scent of leather balls and chalk dust would mingle with the sweet fragrance of historical change. On the morning of June 20th, 1789, representatives of the Third Estate arrived at their usual meeting place, the Salle des Menus Plaisirs, only to find the doors locked and guarded by soldiers. The shock of this apparent betrayal, the fear that the king intended to dissolve their assembly before their work had even begun, drove 576 of the 507 representatives to seek shelter in a nearby indoor tennis court. In that simple room, with its polished wooden floors and high windows that filtered the morning light, they would take an oath that would echo through history. The tennis court oath was not delivered with thunder and lightning, but in words that carried the quiet force of absolute conviction. These men, lawyers, merchants, and professionals from across France, pledged not to separate and to reassemble wherever necessary until the Constitution of the kingdom is established. The ceremony was simple. Each man stepped forward to sign his name to a document that would transform them from mere representatives of an estate into architects of a new nation. Only one man, Joseph Martin Dauch, refused to sign, declaring that he would execute only decisions made by the monarch. His solitary dissent served only to highlight the remarkable unity of the others, who had chosen to place their faith in the future rather than in the traditions of the past. As July's summer heat settled over Paris like a heavy blanket, the city's narrow streets buzzed with rumors and anxiety. The scent of fresh bread, when it could be found, mingled with the less pleasant odors of overcrowded neighborhoods where working families lived in conditions that grew more precarious with each passing day. News traveled through the city like ripples in a pond. The king had dismissed Jacques Necker, the popular finance minister who had attempted to address the kingdom's financial crisis. This act, seeming to confirm the monarchy's intention to resist all reform, transformed simmering discontent into something far more dangerous. On the morning of July 14th, the eastern districts of Paris awakened to find themselves at the center of history. The Bastille fortress, that ancient symbol of royal authority, stood like a medieval giant in the midst of the modern city. Built in the 14th century to defend against English attacks during the 100 Years' War, the fortress had evolved over the centuries into something far different from its original purpose. Its 8 towers, each 78 feet high and 10 feet thick at their bases, enclosed a structure 223 feet wide and 121 feet deep, surrounded by ditches fed by the Seine River. By 1789, the Bastille served primarily as a state prison, though it held only 7 inmates on that fateful July morning. The crowd that gathered outside the fortress gates was driven not by any desire to free these few prisoners, but by desperate need for the gunpowder stored within the Bastille's walls. Paris had armed itself by raiding the Invalides that morning, seizing thousands of muskets, but weapons without powder were useless. The fortress governor, Bernard-René de Launay, found himself caught between impossible alternatives: surrender the gunpowder and betray his oath to the king, or resist and face the consequences of firing upon French citizens. For hours he attempted negotiation, hoping to find some middle path that might preserve both his honor and his life. The sound of the first shots echoed off the stone walls like thunder, but rather than dispersing the crowd, the violence only strengthened their resolve. What had begun as a demand for gunpowder transformed into something larger, a symbolic assault on the very foundations of the old order. When Governor de Launay finally surrendered, lowering the drawbridge and opening the gates, he may have hoped for mercy. Instead, he was killed by the crowd, his head paraded through the streets on a pike in a grisly celebration that marked the beginning of revolutionary violence. The provost of Paris merchants, Flessels, met a similar fate, his death serving notice that the old authorities could no longer count on the deference that had protected them for centuries. But the fall of the Bastille was more than a single day's violence. It was the moment when abstract political theory became concrete revolutionary action. The fortress itself, that medieval monument to royal power, would be demolished stone by stone over the following months, its destruction as systematic and thorough as the transformation of French society. Some of those stones would be carved into miniature Bastilles and sold as souvenirs, while others would be incorporated into bridges and buildings across Paris, ensuring that the physical remnants of the old order would serve the new. The key to the fortress main gate would be presented to George Washington by the Marquis de Lafayette, carrying the symbolism of revolution across the Atlantic to America, where it would be displayed as a testament to the power of popular will over established authority. Yet even as Parisians celebrated in the streets, drinking wine and dancing to the sound of fiddles and drums, the deeper currents of change were already carrying France toward destinations that none could foresee. The National Assembly, emboldened by the news from Paris, began the systematic dismantling of the social structure that had defined French civilization for centuries. On the night of August 4th, 1789, in a session that lasted until dawn, noble deputies rose one after another to renounce their ancient privileges: the abolition of feudalism, the end of seigneurial rights, the elimination of tax exemptions, all fell away in a cascade of speeches that transformed centuries of tradition into historical curiosities. 3 weeks later, on August 26, 1789, the Assembly would produce a document that crystallized these revolutionary changes into principles that would echo across centuries. The Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen emerged from heated debates conducted in the summer heat of Versailles, where representatives sweated through long sessions attempting to capture in words the essence of their revolutionary vision. The document they created was as elegant in its simplicity as it was radical in its implications. Men are born and remain free and equal in rights. Social distinctions can be founded only on the common utility. These 17 articles, printed on broadsides and posted in public squares across France, proclaimed that governments derive their just powers from the consent of the governed, that all citizens are equal before the law, and that freedom of thought, speech, and religion are natural rights that no authority may legitimately suppress. The influence of the American experience was unmistakable in these French declarations. The Virginia Declaration of Rights, which proclaimed that all men are by nature equally free and independent, provided a template that French lawmakers adapted to their own circumstances. Yet the French went further than their American counterparts, declaring not merely independence from a distant monarch, but the complete reconstruction of society itself. Where Americans had sought to preserve their existing liberties against British encroachment, the French proclaimed entirely new relationships between ruler and ruled, between privilege and merit, between tradition and justice. As autumn arrived in 1789, bringing with it the crisp air and golden light that had witnessed so many harvests in centuries past, France found itself caught between celebration and crisis. The political revolution proclaimed in halls and written in declarations would soon encounter the harsh realities of daily survival. The price of bread continued to rise even as political freedoms expanded, and the gap between revolutionary theory and revolutionary practice would prove as treacherous as any military campaign. It was then that the women of Paris would write their own chapter in the revolutionary story, transforming what might have remained an abstract political movement into something far more immediate and personal. On the morning of October 5th, their voices would rise not in formal debate, but in the ancient cry of mothers whose children faced hunger. The sound of a drum beaten by a young woman at the edge of Les Halles Market would prove as significant as any parliamentary speech, its rhythm calling together thousands of women whose patience with political promises had finally reached its end. These women, their hands roughened by work and their faces marked by worry, understood revolution in terms far more concrete than constitutional theory. They knew that bread cost 9 sous per loaf when their husbands earned perhaps 30 sous per day, that families with children consumed 2 loaves daily, and that the mathematics of survival left no room for the luxuries that others took for granted. Their march to Versailles would be fueled not by abstract principles, but by the most fundamental of human needs, the desire to feed their families and secure their children's future. The 12-mile journey from Paris to Versailles on that October morning was unlike any royal procession that had ever traveled that road. Instead of gilded carriages and prancing horses, this parade consisted of thousands of women walking through the autumn rain, their wooden shoes splashing through puddles, their voices raised in songs that mixed patriotic verses with ancient work chants. They carried kitchen knives and improvised weapons, but their most powerful tool was their collective determination to be heard by a king who had seemed deaf to their pleas. Leading them was Stanislas Marie Maillard, a hero of the Bastille storming, whose presence gave their movement a legitimacy that authorities could not easily dismiss. The crowd that arrived at Versailles around noon was unlike anything the palace had ever witnessed. Where courtiers typically approached with elaborate bows and whispered conversations, these women burst into the halls with demands that brooked no delay. They invaded the National Assembly, some beating priests whom they viewed as betrayers of the people's cause, others presenting their grievances with an eloquence born of desperation. Their message was simple and undeniable. The people needed bread, and they would not leave until they received assurance that their basic needs would be met. The confrontation that followed revealed the fundamental transformation that had already occurred in French society, even if its full implications were not yet apparent. When a delegation of women was admitted to see King Louis XV, they did not approach with the traditional ceremonies of respect and deference. Instead, they spoke to him as citizens addressing their elected representative, demanding explanations for policies that affected their daily lives. The king, accustomed to discussions conducted in the abstract language of state policy, found himself face to face with the human consequences of political decisions. That night, as October darkness settled over Versailles, the palace became the scene of violence that would shatter forever the illusion of royal inviolability. Some of the more radical women broke into the palace itself, searching for Marie Antoinette with cries of vengeance that echoed through corridors where whispered conversations had previously been the loudest sounds. The queen escaped to her husband's chambers, but several guards were killed, their blood staining marble floors that had never before witnessed such violence. When morning came, the message was clear. The monarchy could no longer count on the sacred respect that had protected it for centuries. The journey back to Paris the following day completed a transformation that had been months in the making. The royal family, accompanied by the National Guard and surrounded by crowds of armed citizens, traveled the same road that had witnessed so many triumphant royal progresses in happier times. But this procession moved in the opposite direction, not from the capital to the palace, but from the palace to the capital, carrying the monarchy away from its ancient seat of power to a city where it would never again enjoy the isolation that had once seemed its birthright. The crowd that lined the route was armed and celebratory, understanding that they were witnessing the end of one era and the beginning of another. For the women who had initiated this dramatic change, the march represented both victory and transformation. They had succeeded in forcing the king to address their immediate concerns about bread supply, but they had also demonstrated a new form of political power that would reshape French society. No longer would political change be the exclusive province of educated men meeting in formal assemblies. The streets themselves had become a forum for political expression, and the voices of ordinary people, especially women, had proven capable of moving kings and changing the course of history. As the seasons turned and 1792 arrived with its promise of spring renewal, France found itself swept along by currents of change that grew stronger and more turbulent with each passing month. The constitutional monarchy that had emerged from the October days proved as unstable as the political compromise it represented. The king, now resident in the Tuileries Palace in Paris rather than the splendid isolation of Versailles, found himself caught between the demands of revolutionary legislators and the expectations of European monarchs who viewed events in France with growing alarm. The delicate balance between old and new, between tradition and transformation, was about to collapse entirely. The spark that ignited this new phase of revolution came from beyond France's borders, as European powers formed coalitions to contain what they viewed as a dangerous contagion of revolutionary ideas. In April 1792, France declared war on Austria, beginning what would become more than 2 decades of almost continuous conflict. The War of the First Coalition would eventually include Prussia, Great Britain, Spain, and other powers united in their determination to restore the old order in France. For the French revolutionaries, these foreign threats provided both justification for more radical measures and an opportunity to export their ideals beyond the boundaries of their own kingdom. The early months of the war brought military disasters that seemed to confirm the warnings of those who had predicted that revolutionary France would collapse under external pressure. French armies, their officer corps depleted by noble émigrés who had fled the country, suffered defeats that brought enemy forces close to Paris itself. The fortress city of Verdun fell to Prussian forces in September 1792, and panic gripped the capital as reports arrived of enemy armies advancing toward the heart of France. It was in this atmosphere of crisis that the revolution entered its most radical phase, driven by the logic that survival required the complete elimination of all enemies, both foreign and domestic. The crucial turning point came at the Battle of Valmy on September 20th, 1792, where French revolutionary forces faced a Prussian army commanded by experienced professional officers. The morning mist that shrouded the battlefield seemed symbolic of the uncertainty that hung over the future of the revolution. When the mist cleared and the French held their ground, withstanding the bombardment and pressure from one of Europe's most formidable military machines, the psychological impact extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation. The German poet Goethe, who witnessed the battle, allegedly declared that from this place and from this day forth commences a new era in the world's history. Whether or not he spoke those exact words, his insight proved prophetic. The victory at Valmy emboldened the National Convention to take the step that had seemed unthinkable just months earlier. On September 21st, 1792, the monarchy was formally abolished, and France was declared a republic. The 1,000-year tradition of sacred kingship, the divine right that had justified royal authority since the crowning of Charlemagne, was swept away with a simple legislative vote. King Louis XVI became Citizen Louis Capet, stripped of his titles and reduced to the same legal status as any other French citizen. The symbolism was as powerful as the legal reality. If kings could be reduced to common citizenship, then truly anything was possible in this new world that was emerging from the ruins of the old. But revolution, once unleashed, proved as difficult to control as a river in spring flood. The execution of Louis XVIII on January 21, 1793, sent shockwaves across Europe and intensified the determination of foreign powers to crush the French experiment. Within France itself, the regicide created a psychological barrier that made compromise with the old order impossible. The revolutionaries had crossed a line from which there could be no retreat, and the logic of their situation demanded ever more extreme measures to ensure their survival. The period that followed, known to history as the Reign of Terror, would test the limits of revolutionary idealism and human endurance. From September 1793 to July 1794, France experienced a systematic attempt to create a new society through the application of revolutionary virtue backed by the threat of the guillotine. The Committee of Public Safety, dominated by figures like Maximilien Robespierre, wielded power with a thoroughness that even absolute monarchs might have envied. Their goal was nothing less than the complete transformation of human nature, the creation of citizens so pure in their republican virtue that corruption and inequality would become impossible. The atmosphere of these months was unlike anything in French history, a strange combination of idealistic enthusiasm and paralyzing fear that touched every aspect of daily life. Revolutionary festivals replaced religious ceremonies with carefully choreographed celebrations designed to instill republican values and create new traditions to replace those that had been swept away. The sound of church bells, which had marked the rhythm of French life for centuries, was replaced by the reading of revolutionary proclamations and the singing of patriotic songs. Citizens were expected to demonstrate their revolutionary fervor through their dress, their speech, and their daily conduct, with any sign of insufficient enthusiasm potentially marking them as enemies of the people. Yet beneath the surface of revolutionary celebration, a darker current ran through French society. The law of suspects, passed in September 1793, authorized the arrest of anyone deemed insufficiently committed to the revolution. The definition of suspicious behavior was so broad as to encompass almost any action or attitude, creating an atmosphere where neighbors might denounce neighbors and friends might betray friends. The revolutionary tribunals, established to process these cases quickly, became assembly lines of revolutionary justice where the presumption of innocence gave way to the presumption of guilt. The human cost of this revolutionary purity was staggering. Approximately 6,600 people were officially executed during the terror, while perhaps 40,000 more died in prison or were killed without trial. These numbers, however, tell only part of the story. For every person who mounted the scaffold, countless others lived in daily fear that their turn might come next. The terror created a society where public virtue became a performance necessary for survival, where genuine emotion had to be hidden behind masks of revolutionary enthusiasm. The irony of the terror was that it consumed not only the revolution's enemies, but many of its most devoted supporters. Robespierre himself, the incorruptible, who had become the symbol of revolutionary virtue, would eventually fall victim to the same logic he had helped create. On July 27, 1794, the 9th of Thermidor in the revolutionary calendar, the man who had sent so many others to their deaths found himself arrested by former allies who had decided that their own survival required his elimination. His execution the following day marked the end of the terror, but it also demonstrated that the revolution had become a force that no single individual could control or direct. The end of the terror brought relief, but not stability to France, as the country struggled to find a middle path between the extremes of revolutionary radicalism and counter-revolutionary reaction. The Constitution of 1795 established the Directory, a new form of government designed to prevent both the chaos of popular democracy and the tyranny of individual dictatorship. The Directory's 5-man executive was intended to provide stable leadership, while the bicameral legislature would represent the will of the people. Yet from its inception, this system faced challenges that would prove insurmountable. The political instability that plagued the Directory reflected deeper tensions within French society that no constitutional arrangement could easily resolve. The electorate, expanded by revolutionary legislation to include all male citizens who met modest property requirements, frequently chose representatives who threatened to overturn the revolutionary settlement. Royalist candidates, benefiting from war weariness and economic discontent, gained significant ground in several elections, terrifying Republican politicians who feared a return to the old order. Neo-Jacobin candidates, meanwhile, advocated for a return to the radical policies of the terror, equally alarming to those who preferred moderation. The Directory's response to these electoral challenges revealed the fragility of its democratic pretensions. Rather than accept unfavorable election results, the government repeatedly resorted to coups and electoral manipulation to maintain its grip on power. The coup of 18 Fructidor in 1797, the coup of 22 Floreal in 1798, and the coup of 30 Prairial in 1799, each demonstrated that the Directory was willing to violate democratic principles to preserve what it saw as the essential gains of the revolution. These actions, while successful in the short term, gradually eroded public confidence in the entire system. The economic challenges facing the Directory were equally daunting, reflecting the accumulated costs of a decade of revolution and war. The partial bankruptcy and debt repudiation of 1797 provided temporary relief but destroyed confidence in government finances. Inflation continued to erode the purchasing power of ordinary citizens, while the ongoing wars demanded ever-increasing resources. The Directory found itself caught in a vicious cycle where military victories were necessary to maintain public support, but the cost of achieving those victories threatened to bankrupt the state. It was in this context that a young general named Napoleon Bonaparte emerged as a figure of national prominence, his victories in Italy providing the Directory with desperately needed military glory. Napoleon's successes at battles like Lodi, Castiglione, and Rivoli not only secured French dominance in northern Italy, but also filled the treasury with tribute from conquered territories. More importantly, his victories demonstrated that the revolution could produce leaders capable of matching and defeating the finest military minds of the old European order. The psychological impact of these successes extended far beyond their immediate military significance. Yet Napoleon's growing reputation also posed a potential threat to the Directory's civilian leadership. Military commanders who could win battles and inspire loyalty among their troops had historically proven dangerous to Republican governments. The Directory attempted to manage this risk by sending Napoleon on the Egyptian expedition of 1798, removing him from European politics while providing him with opportunities for further glory. This strategy initially seemed successful, as Napoleon's victories in Egypt enhanced his reputation while keeping him far from Paris. The collapse of the Directory came not through dramatic revolution, but through the quiet maneuvering of ambitious politicians who sensed that the time was ripe for change. By 1799, French society had grown weary of instability, corruption, and the endless cycle of coups that had marked the Directory's tenure. The military situation, while improved from the dark days of 1792, remained precarious, with French forces suffering defeats in Germany and Italy that recalled earlier periods of crisis. The domestic economy struggled under the weight of war expenditures and currency instability, while civil servants went unpaid and basic services deteriorated throughout the country. It was in this atmosphere of crisis and exhaustion that Napoleon Bonaparte returned from Egypt in October 1799, landing at the port of Frejus to find a nation ready for strong leadership. His journey to Paris resembled a triumph, with crowds gathering at every stop to cheer the general who had brought glory to French arms in distant lands. Yet Napoleon was too shrewd a politician to rely solely on popular acclaim. He understood that lasting power required the support of established political figures who could provide legitimacy for change. The conspiracy that would bring Napoleon to power was hatched not in military camps, but in the elegant salons of Paris, where politicians like the Abbé Sieyès sought a sword to implement constitutional changes that they believed necessary for France's survival. Sieyès, one of the original architects of the revolution, had grown disillusioned with the Directory's instability and sought to create a more efficient form of government. Napoleon, with his military reputation and political ambition, seemed the perfect instrument for achieving these goals. The events of 18 and 19 Brumaire, November 9th to 10th, 1799, unfolded with a mixture of careful planning an improvised desperation that would characterize much of Napoleon's later career. The first day proceeded according to plan. The Council of Ancients, citing a fabricated terrorist threat, voted to transfer the legislative sessions to the Palace of Saint-Cloud, outside Paris, while appointing Napoleon as commander of all troops in the region. This maneuver removed the legislators from the potentially hostile environment of Paris, while placing military force firmly in Napoleon's hands. The second day at Saint-Cloud nearly ended in disaster for the conspirators. When Napoleon appeared before the Council of 500 to explain the situation, he was met not with respectful attention, but with cries of "Down with the dictator and outlaw him." The general, more comfortable on battlefields than in political assemblies, seemed to lose his composure, stammering and retreating in apparent confusion. It was only the quick thinking of his brother Lucien Bonaparte, who served as president of the council, that saved the conspiracy from collapse. Lucien's dramatic gesture of drawing his sword and pointing it at his brother's chest, declaring that he would kill Napoleon himself if he ever threatened liberty, provided enough confusion for military force to clear the hall. The aftermath of the coup was as significant as the event itself, marking the end of one phase of the revolution and the beginning of another. The Directory was formally abolished and replaced by the consulate, a new form of government ostensibly headed by 3 consuls, but in reality dominated by Napoleon as first consul. The other 2 consuls, Sieyès and Roger Ducos, quickly discovered that they had created not a partnership, but a dictatorship, as Napoleon systematically concentrated power in his own hands. As the 18th century drew to its close, France had traveled a distance that could not be measured in miles or years, but only in the transformation of human possibilities. The world of 1799 bore little resemblance to that of 1789, not merely in its political arrangements, but in its fundamental assumptions about the relationship between rulers and ruled, privilege and merit, tradition and progress. The revolution that had begun with demands for bread and constitutional monarchy had evolved into something far more radical, a demonstration that entire societies could be remade through human will and political action. The changes were visible everywhere, from the smallest details of daily life to the grandest questions of political philosophy. Revolutionary festivals had replaced religious ceremonies, creating new rhythms of celebration that emphasized civic rather than spiritual values. The revolutionary calendar had renamed the months and reorganized time itself, attempting to break the connection between present and past that had previously seemed unbreakable. Even personal names had been revolutionized, as parents chose classical appellations like Brutus and Cato for their children rather than the Christian names that had predominated for centuries. Yet perhaps the most significant change was one of atmosphere and expectation. The revolution had demonstrated that political change was possible, that existing arrangements were not natural laws, but human creations that could be altered by human action. This realization would echo far beyond France's borders, inspiring democratic movements and national liberation struggles for generations to come. The very language of politics had been transformed, as words like citizen, nation, and republic acquired new meanings that would shape political discourse throughout the modern era. The costs of this transformation had been enormous, measured not only in the thousands who died during the terror, but in the broader social disruption that accompanied the collapse of traditional institutions. Families had been divided by political differences, communities torn apart by competing loyalties, and entire regions devastated by civil war. The economic consequences of revolution and war would plague France for decades, while the political instability that led to Napoleon's rise suggested that the revolutionary settlement remained incomplete. As we drift toward sleep on this autumn night, let us remember that the French Revolution was not a single event, but a process of transformation that continued long after the last barricade was dismantled and the final revolutionary festival concluded. The ideas unleashed in those 10 years, that governments should serve the people rather than the reverse, that individuals should be judged by their actions rather than their birth, that societies can be reformed through reason and will, would continue to shape human aspirations for centuries to come. The revolution that began with the scent of fresh bread in Parisian markets and the sound of wooden clogs on cobblestones had become something universal, a demonstration that the future need not merely repeat the past, but could be consciously created by those brave enough to imagine a different world. The story that unfolded between 1789 and 1799 reminds us that history is not the inevitable result of impersonal forces, but the product of countless individual choices made by ordinary people facing extraordinary circumstances. From the peasants who refused to pay feudal dues to the women who marched on Versailles, from the representatives who took the tennis court oath to the soldiers who held the line at Valmy, the French Revolution was shaped by people who chose to act rather than accept, to hope rather than despair, to believe that a better world was possible. Tonight, as we close our eyes and let sleep carry us away from the present moment, we can hear in the distance the echo of those revolutionary voices, reminding us that the future remains unwritten and that each generation must choose anew how to organize society, how to balance freedom and order, how to create conditions where human dignity can flourish. The French Revolution ended in 1799, but the revolution of human possibilities that it represented continues still, carried forward by all those who believe that the world can be better than it is, and who are willing to work to make that belief a reality.